guns had been made for centuries before steel was invented. So how did the early medieval barrels deal with the forces generated by firing?
Well, once they got the gunpowder and it was able to burn and produce a large amount of gas, they needed to contain that in some sort of pressure vessel. And they did that by using strips of wood bound together with hoops, and that was able to contain the pressure and allow a projectile to be fired out.
These iron hoops would be heated until they were red hot. Then they were hammered into place. As they cooled, they would shrink to a tight fit around the wooden staves.
And it was the cooper's skills of those days that we used. And what was it known as? It was known as a barrel. And it was that name that stuck through history.
The end result was a gun that appears crude, but could be terrifyingly effective.
If it wasn't the psychological effect of having something belching fire and smoke at you, when you first encountered a gun on the battlefield, to see that happen would have been quite startling, particularly to people who were superstitious or religious.
This type of artillery, at a stroke, leveled the playing field of battle.
Should you manage to get your artillery into the right position, it would literally sweep all opposition away.
But these early hoop and stave guns soon began to show their limitations.
Now, although this was an easy way to construct a barrel, it wasn't necessarily the strongest way, because as you can see, you've got a number of weak points where the gas can escape through these sections of wood.
When this hoop and stave gun is fired, a lot of the energy is wasted. Seen again on a high-speed camera, this becomes clear. The large plume of smoke and gas escaping between the staves at the rear of the barrel shows how inefficient this gun is. Many of the early medieval guns suffered from this problem or worse.
The problem was, once gunpowder did go off, was containing the explosion and making sure the explosion drove the cannonball out of the gun and did not blow the gun to pieces.
And there are all sorts of problems in the early days with the hoops and staves coming apart and very often causing as much injury to the home team as the enemy.
If the gun was to reach its full potential on the battlefield, it would need a much stronger barrel. Its destructive force had to be controlled. As Europe came out of the Dark Ages in the 14th century, the gun was emerging into the light.
There was a need for some form of new weapon. Military technology never stands still. Man is always looking for another method of killing other men or demolishing their buildings.
But the unreliability of early guns was causing problems. What artillery needed was a means of producing a stronger barrel.
The science of gun barrel making really starts with the old gunsmiths in the medieval times. These guys were alchemists, they were witches, they were all sorts of things.
It may have seemed like magic, but in fact, it was casting from bronze. This centuries-old technology was now being perfected as foundries became capable of handling large amounts of molten metal. Reproduction cast bronze guns are still made today at this foundry in Middlesbrough, using skills perfected in the Middle Ages. Molten metal is poured into a mold and then allowed to set.
If you cast a cannon solid out of bronze, what you're getting is something which has far more inherent strength. There are no gaps, no points of weakness.
Once the cast has cooled, the finished gun is revealed.
Effectively, by the middle of the 15th century, we've got the artillery gun that's going to be with us really for the next 300 years.
Over the following centuries, the gun became the backbone of battle. Its design was refined to fire bigger and better shells, further and further. But at the same time, the defenses against the gun were becoming stronger. In the middle of the 19th century, artillery was beginning to meet its match.
If one takes the Crimean War, it was a pivotal moment in armaments development.
On the shores of the Black Sea, the Russian fortress of Sebastopol was being pounded by an incredible artillery bombardment.
The French and the British fired something like 50,000 tons of iron. It did a lot of damage, but it didn't destroy Sebastopol at all.
The gun barrel had reached the limits of its power, but this was 1854, and the Industrial Revolution was transforming technology across the world.
When the Industrial Revolution comes around, our lives are completely changed. Everything, every aspect of our lives will be revolutionized, including, of course, warfare.
There was a new, ambitious generation of engineers, men like Robert Mallet. In the middle of the Crimean War, he turned his attention to artillery. Mallet calculated that to destroy a fort like Sebastopol would require a huge, cast-iron cannonball. But there was no gun barrel in the world strong enough or big enough to fire such a projectile. So he built one.
Mallet set about completely revolutionizing gun design technology. And instead of making it out of one piece of cast iron, in effect he produced a fairly thin-walled tube of iron, and on the outside of that he shrunk rings of wrought iron. Not just one layer, but several layers. So by the time he'd built up his 5, 6, 7 layers of rings, he'd created a gun of enormous strength.
Mallet's mortars remain to this day the largest bore artillery ever built. The width across the muzzle is an extraordinary 3 feet. Each cannonball weighs 1 ton. But this gun could only be built because it was now possible to handle and work huge quantities of metal. Machine power was taking over from manpower. The forging press making this gun barrel is more than 100 years old, but it still makes highly effective modern guns for the British Army. It can exert a force of up to 2,500 tons, squeezing huge ingots of steel like a banana. It was machinery of this scale that gave birth to the big gun at the end of the 19th century.
Once the Industrial Revolution had unleashed the industrial genie, if you like, the impetus to build bigger and bigger guns was unstoppable.
The shackles were off. Guns were constructed that could hit targets at ranges of more than 60 miles and sink ships with a single shell. The age of the supergun had arrived.
Right, let's get this map under control, Nick.
Not far from the White Cliffs of Dover lies a hidden gem.
Good grief, they're absolutely huge, aren't they?
80 tons.
Guns are never in.
Each gun, 30 foot long.
Good grief.
Firing a projectile that's 3/4 of a ton.
So like firing a Volkswagen out into the middle of the channel.
Look at this breach. Now, there's a 6 foot diameter there. All beautiful.
These are the guns of the Dover turret, built in 1879 to fire at warships miles out into the English Channel. This was a massive task of engineering and construction.
Well, Nick, looking around at these guns, they strike me as some sort of form of Victorian weapon of mass destruction, some sort of super gun of the 1880s. Is that a fair assessment?
They're super guns, but they're massive weapons of destruction. But they were intended to destroy enemy battleships. It would have been fascinating to see if throwing these massive 3/4 ton projectiles, they would have blown ships out of the water.
For all their impressiveness, the Dover turret guns never fired a shot in anger, but they remain a testament to the great Victorian engineers. Today's gun barrels owe everything to the Industrial Revolution. Bronze and iron have been superseded by a metal with up to 4 times the tensile strength. High-grade steel. These gun barrels are machined to 1/1000th of a millimeter precision. So the gun barrel has come a long way since the days of wooden staves and iron hoops. In the end, a gun is all about one thing.
I think the first thing you need to understand when designing a new gun is the purpose of a gun. What you actually see is just a chunk of solid metal. The purpose of a gun is to actually deliver a shell a distance.
It's what a gun fires that determines how effective it is. The projectile is the most important component of all.